For analysis on all of this, I'm joined by Stephen Fish from the University of California, Berkeley. He's a political science professor there. Stephen, let's start by just kind of touching on what you just heard. He's describing the situation there. It looks pretty terrible right now compared to 24 hours ago. We're talking about a truce, and yet it doesn't seem very safe on the ground for people who live there in that city.
No, it doesn't. It looks like they're really in the thick of things right now, and it looks like things could get much worse before they get better. It's possible, of course, that things will die down a little bit, that this little truce that was just mentioned between the government and the anti-government forces will hold. It could hold for a day or two, maybe longer than that. But since, as your previous guest mentioned, neither side really seems to be willing to compromise, it seems unlikely that we're going to see any kind of lasting stability and peace from here on out.
And Stephen, Nathan King made, I think, a very good point talking about Independence Square. It's easy to focus on just one particular area. Ukraine, it's a big, big country, and there are a lot of different viewpoints. How would you describe how the country sits right now?
That's the question that we all wish we knew the answer to, and that we don't have a really good fix on. What I've seen in terms of the best public opinion polls, and this is going back over several years, is that the country's pretty evenly divided. Roughly half of Ukrainians are pretty clearly in favor of closer relations with Europe, and roughly half of Ukrainians closer relations with Russia. Ukrainians tend to be more united when it comes to just having better government. President Yanukovych is unpopular even with some Russophiles, some people who favor good relations with Russia. I also think, though, it's important to note that some of the extreme demands that some of the protesters are making for kind of breaking things off with Russia, heading toward Europe unequivocally, don't resonate really with the majority of the population either. Most Ukrainians are not anti-Russian. They don't have a kind of knee-jerk anti-Russian feeling. So things are actually quite complicated in terms of opinion.
Well, you said complicated, and I want to touch on that because, Stephen, it seems like everyone kind of frames this as a one-dimensional argument. Either they're going with the West or they're going with Russia, and they put the protesters in a nice little box, too. They're all sort of one-dimensional as well, and that basically is not the case, is it? I mean, I heard a politician from Ukraine earlier today saying that you know, you have Yanukovych, who was elected in a democratic election, but that he's tried to dismantle the democracy and that people are really angry with him. It's not just about Russia and the West. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. These protests started off as a reaction to Yanukovych, President Yanukovych of Ukraine's decision to forego closer relations with the European Union in favor of a plan that President Putin of Russia offered him, which involved closer relations with Russia. That sparked the protests. But what's really kept them going is the government's ham-fisted, violent response to the protests, and this is going back several months. The government's attack on journalists and the use of thugs by the government to attack journalists. The attempt to try to ban certain freedoms of speech and association. These are the things that really ticked people off and kept people out in the streets. Plus the fact that the Yanukovych government has been so corrupt and so incompetent in so many ways.
And Stephen, none of us can look into a crystal ball, but if you would, give me your sense of what you think is going to happen there now, moving forward.
Of course, it's very hard to say. I think on the one side we have a government that is pretty unequivocally bad. I don't think it's all that complicated on the government side, frankly. I think you have a highly corrupt, very badly mismanaged government in place, and President Yanukovych and his cronies. He spent more time enriching his family than he has really focusing on governing the country, and has built up a cadre of cronies that just kind of live off the fat of his presidency. On the protester side, though, things are very diverse and very complicated. You've got some real dyed-in-the-wool Democrats who just want a free Ukraine and good government. You've also got some extreme nationalists who aren't such savory characters. And the leaders of the main parties don't really have full control within the opposition over the behavior of their members. Many of the leaders of these parties would like the Molotov cocktails to stop flying. And yet, some of the angriest members of the opposition are in fact engaging in such violence. Right now, I think the short-term prognosis has to be pretty bad for any kind of early settlement, because on the one hand, the government does not seem to be backing down, and clearly the Russian government, President Putin, has given President Yanukovych of Ukraine the green light to crack down as hard as he wants to. And he's made it clear, Putin has, that Putin will support Yanukovych's crackdown no matter how harsh it is.
All right.
That's
Stephen,
on one side.
Stephen, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much for your analysis. Stephen Fish joining us from Northern California this evening.